How about expert corroboration? How about Danny Jawenko, 27-year controlled demolitions expert? It starts from below. They've simply blown away the columns. It's controlled demolition. A team of experts did this. It's professional work, without a doubt. How about Hugo Bachmann, Professor Emeritus, Chairman, Department of Structural Dynamics at Earthquake Engineering, Swiss Federal Institute of Technology. In my opinion, the building, World Trade Center 7, was with great probability professionally demolished. How about Kamal Obeid with Architects and Engineers for 9/11 Truth, a structural engineer? A localized failure in a steel frame building like World Trade Center 7 cannot cause a catastrophic collapse like a house of cards without a simultaneous and patterned loss of several of its columns at key locations within the building. Does that sound like fire? No. How about this forensic fire protection engineer, once again, Jonathan Barnett?
We were surprised that Tower 7 collapsed, we being the team that investigated what occurred on that day.
Building 7, do we have any foreknowledge of its destruction? We're moving the command post over this way. That building's coming down, says Chief Nick Viscani. Well, there was some structural damage, as we've noted, and they were concerned about it. By noon or 1 o'clock, they told us we had to move from the triage site up to Pace University, a little further away, because Building 7 was going to come down, or being brought down, says Indira Singh, interviewed by Bonnie Faulkner on KPFA. Did they actually use the words brought down? Yeah, that's what they said. We're going to have to bring it down. This involves volition. Listen to these construction workers walking away from Building 7, and this police officer caught on CNN camera.
Keep your eye on that building. It'll be coming down.
Building's about to blow up. Move it back.
All right, guys.
We are walking back. There's a building about to blow up. On flame. Debris coming down.
Keep your eye on that building. It's about to come down. The building is about to blow up. Flame and debris coming down. How do they know? And how about Kevin McPadden? What did he say?
And at the last few seconds, he took his hand off, and you heard 3, 2, 1.
Countdown? Does that imply foreknowledge? Do fires bring buildings down to countdowns? Unlikely. In fact, the BBC announces the collapse 20 minutes before it happened. It's true. Jane Stanley is here announcing it. She says the 47-story Solomon Brothers building close to the World Trade Center has also collapsed. And there it is standing behind her. The BBC apologizes for this grievous error, citing the confusing events of the day. But does that make them psychic? Unlikely. Is there some kind of script that's handed out, like the guy on the street, the Twin Towers, who had all the answers? I believe we've shown that Building 7 matches all of the features of controlled demolition in the classic sense. Is it likely that Al-Qaeda could have had access to this building, which had to have been one of the most secure outside the Pentagon? We have to ask ourselves that question a few times, because if they didn't, then who did? This is as far as we go. You need to go farther, and there are resources at your disposal to do just that. I will point them out after we look at the World Trade Center Twin Towers, because as clear as the evidence is for the destruction of Building 7 by explosives, the evidence is even more clear in the case of the Twin Towers. When you look at it with a new pair of glasses and looking at the forensic science-based evidence. Let's get introduced here. Some called it the crowning achievement of the international style, this pair of buildings. Others, heartless modernism. In fact, architect Robert Stern calls it gigantic dumbness, right? It's two squares extruded just to the point where they become the highest buildings in the world. Well, either way, no matter how you feel about these buildings, they did have innovative structural engineering led by John Skilling and his aide, Leslie Robertson, who helped Minoru Yamasaki preserve the simple sculptural purity of his forms. And you can compare this building to the elegant Art Deco of the Empire State Building and come to your own conclusions about design. But it did eclipse the highest building in the world in 1976, but just for a couple of years until the Sears Tower outgrew it. The structural engineering innovations were quite extraordinary, lending the award, the engineering project that demonstrates the greatest engineering skills and represents the greatest contribution to engineering progress and mankind by the American Society of Civil Engineers. Let's take a look at what we achieved. We have 60-foot spans. We have a perimeter structure, which is like a tube structure, and this inner core. Let's take a look at it. Most high-rises up to this time were built on a dense grid of steel or concrete frames all the way throughout the building in a 20 or 30-foot grid. The Twin Towers were built as a tube structure with a very dense, strong mesh of steel surrounding the exterior and acting as a bearing wall, which resists the lateral loads, earthquake, and in the case of this building, particularly wind. Hurricanes up to 140 miles an hour it was designed to resist. This perimeter structure was 14-inch columns, 3 foot 9 inches on center. Inside was this core, a dense grid of 47 immense box columns, 4-inch thick at the base, 2-inch thick at mid-height. Prefabricated floor assemblies with 22-gauge steel decking, over which was poured reinforced concrete and held up by 29-inch deep open-web steel trusses. All of this, by the way, was completely pulverized on this floor structure on 9/11. We'll take a look at that. Now, these trusses were bolted to the perimeter columns and the core columns with these 5/8-inch bolts, which we talked about the different theories about what happened to those bolts. Now, this is a structure within a structure. This dense core structure would have remained standing 1,300 feet in the air if this surrounding, less strong floor structure were to have collapsed around it. In fact, the perimeter structure probably would have been left standing for a while until its lack of support gave in. This is the core columns, 52 inches by 22 inches along the long edge, almost solid steel at the bottom, continuously welded from the bottom all the way to the top. Now, any 1,800-degree fire would have been almost immediately conducted throughout this 100,000-ton heat sink. That's the reason there's been no collapse of steel frame high-rise fires, because of this steel. Hold a spoon over the stove. See how long you can hang on to it. Almost instantly, you'll be forced to let it go. Let's take a look at the structural imperative that was given to John Skilling.
John Skilling and Les Robertson were the structural engineers who designed the streamlined steel frames of the Twin Towers in the 1960s. Because a wayward Army bomber flew into the Empire State Building in 1945, the towers were built with skyscraper crashes in mind.
We had designed the project for the impact of our largest airplane of its time, the Boeing 707. That is to take this jet airplane, run it into the building, destroy a lot of structure, and still have it stand up.
The building was designed to have a fully loaded 707 crash into it. That was the largest plane at the time. I believe that the building probably could sustain multiple impacts of jetliners because this structure is like the mosquito netting on your screen door, this intense grid, and the jet plane is just a pencil puncturing that screen netting. It really does nothing to the screen netting.
A very robust structure, in fact. The forces coming down routed themselves around. They arched around the opening created by the airplane. In fact, Iger says the towers withstood the initial impact of the aircraft. This ability to withstand the initial impact is hardly surprising, given the robust nature. Now, we have the North Tower being hit at 8:46 in the morning. And about 102 minutes later, after fires traveled around the floors and up the floors in the case of the North Tower, the building did collapse. The South Tower was hit about 15 minutes later, and after only about 56 minutes, it collapses, as the fires were in fact diminishing severely.